It's the argument. It's the dramatic question stated. Act two is about antithesis. It's the drama played out. And then act three is synthesis or integration. How can we take these two seemingly disparate ideas and that collide and lead us to a deeper truth? So, and then these two seemingly disparate ideas involve the dilemma. So for example, justice. Justice would be powerful desire. I want justice. The false belief is that when I kill my enemy, justice will be done. By the end of the story, your protagonist reframes their relationship to what justice means. They might discover that true justice means discovering perhaps that I'm complicit in this thing. It might be a mystery story or a thriller where they discover that in their attempt to uncover justice, they discover something about their beloved that creates a dilemma where if I do kill my enemy, I will in some way be complicit in the crime.
Now you say that we are not the author or the channel. If we take something, let's say like Oppenheimer,
Yeah.
amazing film,
Yeah.
that's based on someone's life, how are we actually a channel when that life has already occurred?
Oh, that's a great question. So if you gave the Oppenheimer story to 10 writers, they're going to write 10 completely different stories, right? Not completely different. I mean, they would have to be some way, germane to the events of his life. But the story is not about what happens. It's about the meaning we ascribe to what happens. So I'll give you an example. So let's just put Oppenheimer aside for a second. Somebody asked me years ago, one of my students, they said, "You're always talking about meaning. What are you talking about?" I said, "Well, I'm going to tell you a story right now. I just made something up. And now this is the stupid example I always give. I'm going to make up a story. I'm going to tell you exactly what happened, but it will be bereft of meaning." So a woman comes home, says to her husband, "We've been married 20 years. I want a divorce." Husband quits his job, gets on a plane, flies to France, goes out to a carrot farm. The farmer rushes out, hugs the man, and together they open a carrot juice restaurant called Carrot Juice Charlie's. I just told you exactly what happened. Doesn't mean anything. So now here's a story with meaning. Woman comes home, says to her husband, "We've been married 20 years and you're still a stranger to me." The man quits his job and flies to France, which is the last place he saw his father alive when he was 8 years old. He goes out to the carrot farm where his father dropped dead of a heart attack. The farmer, who was the father's best friend, rushes out and hugs the son, still distraught over his inability to save the man, leaving the boy orphaned. Together, they open a carrot juice restaurant in honor of the boy's father, whose name was Charlie, and they begin the process of healing. So it's not what happens, it's the meaning we ascribe to it. I can't tell you how many writers I work with that will say, they'll say, "Well, my character would never do that." And my answer is always, well, if you have an impulse, if an idea comes to you and you dismiss it because you think your idea is your character wouldn't do that, you're actually cutting off the channel. Your job as a storyteller, I believe, is to support what your subconscious gives you. I can't tell you how many times I see second acts start to flatline because we get so attached to our idea of how the story ought to go that we disconnect from the truth of what the story wants to be. I'll give you another example. I don't know why I always bring up It's a Wonderful Life, but I don't know if you remember the midpoint of It's a Wonderful Life, but this is where Mr. Potter offers George Bailey a job. Now imagine for a moment that you're writing this story. That would make no sense logically for the devil, for the primary antagonist, to offer the hero a job because they're in direct competition with each other. But here's the thing, as a storyteller, he doesn't offer the George Bailey from Act 1 a job. He offers the George Bailey from the middle of Act 2 a job. This is the midpoint. This is where your protagonist experiences temptation between what they want and what they need. And George Bailey considers taking the job because this is how we experience how desperately he wants to leave Bedford Falls, that he would actually consider working for the devil. So this is why story structure is so important, and this is why an outline, particularly in screenwriting, is essential, because without an outline, your idea of your story is never going to get you to the end, because you're going to be so attached to what you think should happen that you're not going to allow yourself to truly be surprised by where the characters want to take you. If you're not allowing yourself to be a little bit embarrassed, a little bit vulnerable, you're going to be protecting yourself in some way. The first exercise I give my writers in the workshop is fear. I call it the fear exercise. And the exercise is simply, I'm afraid to write this story because. You write for 5 minutes listing all your fears. And then I ask the writer, I go, why do you think you do this exercise? And they always go, well, it's probably really helpful to become aware of your fears so they don't rule you. And I go, well, that's part of it, for sure. But here's the deeper truth, is the fears you have in writing your story are identical in nature to the fears that your protagonist has in the story. And so when you allow yourself to be vulnerable on the page and list your fears in writing the story, you are you're connecting to the truth of your story, and you're discovering how you are uniquely qualified to write this story. Because you're writing from this raw, vulnerable place. I think sometimes we have this idea of what it means to be a good writer. But when I work with writers, I stay out of the result. It's all about process. And I truly believe that the story lives fully and completely within the writer. I fully believe that their subconscious is the seat of their genius. So my job is to facilitate the writer in finding this story that already lives fully and completely within them. So it's if you make the thrill of creation its own reward, you're going to start to get to something that's really exciting. And you've got to, my job is to be curious. It's the Socratic method. It's just asking questions. And I'll say one other thing. It's got to come from love. It's got to come from open-hearted curiosity. It can never be curiosity, because I see creative teachers do this sometimes, of if it's not coming from a spirit of play, like we're just in the sandbox, we don't have to worry about anything, the writer is going to get self-conscious, and they're going to protect themselves, which is what you're kind of talking about. And it's so easy for artists. There's something so fragile about this process. It's so easy for artists to get into their ego. I'll tell you a funny story. Louis B. Mayer created the Academy of Motion Pictures Arts and Sciences in 1929 because he was afraid that the actors were going to unionize. Because he had the stagehands built and he had discovered they had just unionized. He goes, oh, the actors are next, and they're going to ruin me. Because when they unionize, they're going to want a piece of the action. So the Oscars were created for strictly monetary reasons. It was to save him money. He saved millions of dollars by creating the Academy Awards. The Academy Awards he was appealing to the actors' egos as a way of protecting his business interests. Award shows, when you really think about it, artists don't need awards. Our egos love awards. But when I was a number of years ago, I won something called the Prix Printemps, which is it's in France, it's the best foreign novel. And I remember I got flown to Paris, and I was for this thing called Festival America with all these famous authors. And I remember being in my booth, and all these people are around me, and I can feel myself, like I was feeling like a big shot. And then I look up, And there's Michael Chabon, who had just won the Pulitzer for Adventures of Cavalier and Clay. And I remember he had his hands in his pockets, and he was kind of looking at me with this half smile, like, dude, what are you doing? And he was very sweet, but in that moment, I felt like he saw me, and I was like, oh, I forgot why I was there, which was because I wasn't being celebrated. The channel was being celebrated. Do you understand what I mean? And it's really dangerous for the artist not to differentiate between the channel and which is all that matters, and then the author, or the ego.
Can we talk about that little spark of an idea you had, I believe it was in your hometown in Alabama, before you came to LA? What was that like?
Well, it's the feeling that every writer should have when they think of an idea. In my case, I couldn't even, I think back on it now and I don't know why it came to me or why I felt like it was, why it got me jazzed. But for some reason I had an image in my head when I was very young and thinking, I was loving movies, but I wasn't quite sure if I had a place in the movie and television industry. But it just occurred to me, wouldn't it be cool if there was this married couple, upscale married couple in a beautiful home, they're both attractive, well-dressed. The husband is dressed for work, goes out the front door because his wife could buy, the door closes behind him, and we hear the voiceover of a police detective saying, "When was the last time you saw your husband, Mrs. McCaughlin?" And that was it. That's all and it's like, that seems really cool. I would want to watch that movie. Why would a guy with a perfect life, seemingly, walk out the front door and never come back? And from that, I built this detective story, which was called Fourth Story eventually, and structured it out. I didn't know what I was doing, but I had seen a lot of movies, and I sort of cobbled together what seemed like a cool detective story, and I eventually wrote it. I came out here to Los Angeles and went to a film school and started comparing it with other people's work and professionals' work and seeing what I'd done wrong and how I could improve it. And I rewrote it many times. The movie eventually was bought and sold and optioned, and I rewrote it many times for different directors and different actors, and eventually it got made years later. But it all started with that spark. And that's true of every great film. Every great film, somebody's has a little glimmer, just a spark. Sometimes they'll share it with us, the writer. For example, Brokeback Mountain. She's not a screenwriter, she's a fiction writer. Annie Proulx was in a bar somewhere in the West. And she's sitting there and she's watching. There's a pool table and the young cowboy types are playing pool, and then she looks over there, sitting at the bar is a crusty looking older cowboy watching the younger cowboys play pool, and it just flickered in her head, I wonder if he's gay. And suddenly, given his age and where she was at the time of the play, she thought, that means he would have come of age probably in the 50s, 1950s. What would his life have been like if he'd been gay, if he is gay? And from that, she structured a short story called Brokeback Mountain, which then was optioned and became a film that we all, even people who've never seen the film, know the term Brokeback Mountain. That's how ubiquitous it became. And that was her moment. And I call it an moment, it's just a term I came up with. It just means the beginning, the start of something, that passionate flicker of excitement that the original writer has, and then which is, if you're lucky, you get it transferred all the way through the many drafts and onto the screen. Obviously, in the case of something like Brokeback Mountain, it worked. But every movie has that thing. And only the original writer can track it down and actually identify it, unless they choose to share it with us. We don't usually know what that moment was. It very often isn't necessarily the most famous scene in the movie, but it has to, you need it to be there. You, the writer, have to have that in order to get yourself through this experience of structuring and writing a screenplay, which is going to take at the minimum weeks and usually months, if not years. So you have to keep coming back to that and saying, what was it I was excited about? Oh yeah, that's what it is. And you keep breathing life on that little ember that if you've done it right, still alive, and it flickers to life and it keeps you going.
Are we sharing that idea with others?
Never. I never share it, nor should anyone else. That's yours to keep. If you try to share it, and that's our instinct when we're starting out. I got this idea for a movie, and let's say I pitched what I just told you was my spark for Fourth Story, and I shared that with somebody, especially somebody who wasn't a writer. And of course, when you're starting out, you're surrounded by people who are not writers, not creative. And they said, I don't get it. What was that? It doesn't seem that interesting. Oh gosh, I guess I shouldn't write it. So never share it. It's only yours. No one else needs to know it. Occasionally, after a movie's successful, sometimes a screenwriter in an interview or something will share it. Alan Ball shared his spark moment in the series, in the Go Draft. I call it the moment. But he shared it for American Beauty, which was him one day sitting, I think it was in New York, and watching a plastic bag bob around in the wind and seeing how beautiful it was. And it was prosaic, and other people would have just thought it was litter, but to him, he saw the beauty behind it. And from that moment, he structured the movie American Beauty, and that scene is still there. It went through many, many, many drafts before it got made, but that scene is still there. The scene that I described about Fourth Story, I rewrote that script many times. It was right there at the very end. It was still there the whole time because it was the thing that got me excited. Therefore, it was probably going to be the thing that got the producers excited, the director excited, actors excited, and ultimately the audience excited if you execute it well enough.
And do you find in this era of, for lack of a better word, oversharing, online, in person, wherever, that it's hard to hold on to that? Because we're kind of conditioned now to show everything online, or even with strangers, wherever, that it's hard to kind of keep that ember private anymore?
It's not hard for me, but I'm not from that era of social media and constant sharing. It probably is harder than I think. One piece of advice: never share anything about your work with anybody unless it's a close personal friend, and preferably a close personal friend who is a writer or an artist. But it's best not to share anything with anybody unless it's in some sort of professional condition. So that's to say, if somebody says, give me a log line for the movie you're working on, don't just blurt something out. Think about what that is. Think about what that one sentence, or that elevator pitch, as they call it. I used to call it a party pitch. When somebody says, hey, what are you doing? And especially if you're in LA and you're going to meet actors and agents and producers, who knows where you're going to meet them, and you might get 20, 30 seconds of their attention. Hey, what are you working on? You should have that party pitch down tight so that you, in 20 or 30 seconds before you lose their attention, you're presenting your idea in its best possible light, in a professional light. If you just go around blurting out stuff, you're doing more harm than good most of the time. The act of presenting your material to the public, even if it's just one person at a party, presenting it, should be taken seriously. The same is true if you're writing up a treatment or a 2-pager description of your idea, an agent or manager or somebody, producer has asked you for it. Take your time, make sure it's right. It's better to have it right than have it fast. And I never, ever, ever, ever send out a draft of anything. I don't want to share that until I know it's my best work. The test I used to use, and still do, and advise other people to do, when you've gotten your draft to a place where you think it's showable, shareable, stop for a moment and picture, what if I send this out to whoever my contact list is, and it comes back a negative response? The people say, I don't get it, I don't like it. How would you feel? Would you feel, obviously you'd be disappointed, but would you feel disappointed and kicking yourself? I should have done another pass. Oh God, why didn't I take a little more time with that? Or would you say, disappointed, but that's my best work, and maybe the timing was wrong or whatever, the planets didn't align this time. I'm hurt, but I'm okay, I'll live with that. If that's the second response is what you'd feel, then it's time for it to go out. But if the first response is what you feel, don't send it out. Look at it.
Okay.
You only get one first impression, so you don't wanna misuse
Oh, okay.
And first impression too with the party pitch, even if
Absolutely.
you're at a friend's
Same thing.
barbecue, yeah.
it. Yeah, you can't go back and say, oh, wait a minute, what I really meant was, you've lost them already. You get one shot. So,
Okay.
and if you don't have it yet, then just say, oh, I'm working on a movie script.
Okay.
Maybe,
God,
can I call you later and tell you about it? But there's other ways to do it. But don't present it until it's ready to be presented. Or better yet, don't go to a party unless you already have that in your head. If anybody asks me, this is what I'm gonna say, and think about it. So it's as tight and as hooky as possible, so that it makes them wanna say, oh, that sounds kind of interesting. When you're done with it, give me a ringle. Give me a jingle, I'd like to talk about it more. That's what you really are going for in those moments, and those moments happen more often than you might think, which is one of the reasons why most people have to move to Los Angeles to break in, because it's hard to do that if you're living in Birmingham, Alabama.
For me, writing dialogue was really at the beginning. It isn't simply a talent. Some people have a natural talent; they can their ear for it and they capture it. But it goes beyond that. You can actually learn how to do this. These are real people. They all have a unique voice. They're all saying what they would say. They're all doing what they would do, and it's never boring. It is just captivatingly interesting. It gets more and more interesting. That's the holy grail. When a writer can do that, they are the needle in the haystack that the industry is looking for. Everyone will want to meet that writer and work with that writer.
In Pulp Fiction, there's a moment where Bruce Willis goes to buy some cigarettes, and he says to the bartender, he says, 1 pack of red apples. And the bartender says, filters? And he says, none. And that's just a really cool, fast, interesting exchange there, as opposed to 5 lines to explain what brand of cigarettes he wants. And, oh, you know what? How about no filters in those cigarettes, Because it's very noirish feel. It's very, clipped and dark and tight. And it's just filters, none. And that just gets the idea across.
Said Claude Rains in Casablanca says to Bogart, he says, what brought you to Casablanca? And Bogart says the waters, and Claude Rains says it's a desert, and Bogart says something like, I was mistaken, I was misinformed, which is great dialogue, just great dialogue. Music, it's music, which is the difference between speak like we're doing here and
interesting dialogue.
an interesting dialogue.
Good writing, good script, the scripts that command attention is with an extraordinary capacity to engage your reader. And that's usually through really smart dialogue.
I always bring out David Mamet, who's, genius at dialogue. And he said once, nobody says anything unless they want something.
Dialogue is about intention. It's about characters in stories want things all the time from the other characters that they're not getting. All of the characters. That's what produces conflict, right? Everyone knows conflict is kind of a necessity of drama. The reason there's conflict is because we don't have the things that we want. And so the best and easiest way to write dialogue is to focus on what your character wants from the other character. And all of the characters have these intentions. It's not just your protagonist. I tend to know my protagonist's intentions pretty naturally because I have a strong sense of the character, and I don't really have to think about it too consciously when I write a scene. Immediately she'll have a strong intention. I don't have to be conscious. I will have to often be conscious about the other characters. They're not there just to serve your protagonist or your needs for the protagonist, right? They also have to have things they want that they don't have. And that's the key. That is the simplest, strongest way to write dialogue, is to be aware of that, is that characters don't have things that they want. And sometimes they talk about it directly, sometimes they don't talk about it directly, right? But the words that are coming out of their mouth are not necessarily related to their want. I mean, they may not say it directly.
First thing you have to understand about dialogue is that it's got to be connected to the character's desire line in the scene. In other words, if a character has an objective, an intention in the scene, the dialogue has to match that intention. And what I see a lot of times, especially with exposition and information, is that a character is saying all that information, and you can tell that it's really the writer's objective. In other words, the writer wants the audience to know this information because they think, okay, the audience needs to know this and this and this and this, so the character is going to say this and this and this. And that doesn't work because scenes and dialogue are about the character's intention in the scene. Everything a character says is matched to what that desire line is. So anything that doesn't belong to that doesn't fit. And you can tell whether it's the writer wanting to know that information, wanting the audience to know that information, whether it's part of the character.
The external goal is their action goal, their physical goal that they need to achieve, kind of like the A story goal. Maybe it's the most obvious or most visual goal. And then the internal, like it says, it's going to be more emotional. It might be the love interest, it might be their family, or it might be just kind of a secondary active goal, but it's not as important as the external. Unless later they flip and maybe the internal becomes more important than the external. If you know your character's external and internal goal, I think it's really going to help you write your dialogue, because then you're writing their dialogue to show what they want and to get them actively toward their goal, you know. We're essentially selfish people, so when we speak, it's because we're trying to get somewhere, we're trying to get something, you know. So it really helps to know their goals.
Nobody's going to say, you know, hey, I'm a trustworthy character. Right? I mean, if somebody said that to you, you're going to be thinking, whoa, why is he telling me this, right? There's always a reason. Why? So there's always a reason. And if we know what the reason is in a movie, if you know what the character wants, or you're trying to figure out what the character wants, that's more interesting than somebody dumping exposition.
But what you can't get away with is writing dialogue without intentions. And the thing is, it makes it so easy to write. That's the good news. You know, you just ask yourself, what are my character's intentions? This character, and I like I said, I like to phrase it in terms of what does the one character want from the other character? And it should be specific. Like, I'm not a fan of loosey-goosey, they want respect. No, I want this person to listen to me right now, right? So real specific, intentions. And the beauty of that is the scenes write themselves. You know, if I just establish, okay, this is this character's intention, that character's intention. I'm just transcribing. I just hear the characters argue with each other. It makes it really easy to write once you know that. It's particularly a requirement if you have a lot of exposition. Because if you don't have intentions, we know that it's just about exposition. Like, there should never be a scene there just because you want us to know something. Now, that said, you're probably going to have some scenes every now and then that are there just because you want us to know something. But you got to hide that. You got to hide that by the fact that people have really strong intentions. And so I'm not noticing, it doesn't reek of exposition to me, because the characters have very forceful things that they want from each other. And so the exposition comes out like as a little byproduct of what they're saying. And so it feels natural. If you don't have intentions and people are talking in exposition, then it'll reek of that, and particularly a writer will notice, even non-writers will notice, it's like, this is really boring. Why are these people just, telling me a bunch of stuff? But if you have intentions, we're not going to notice that, or we're not going to notice as much.
Characters who just dump exposition, it's just boring because it's not connected to a desire line. Even characters who disagree with each other, even though that might be kind of interesting because there's some tension there, if we don't know what they want, it's going to be boring. So you see this a lot with amateur scenes of people like, oh, I need conflict, so my character is just going to argue, and so you have people arguing back and forth, but it doesn't mean anything. It's just right because we don't know what they want. And that's really what makes something interesting is intention and obstacle to that.
If, for example, let's say my goal is to dramatize for the audience that a woman loves her son, her young son. Now, I could show them walking down the street together, and they could, I love you, honey. I love you too, mommy. Well, I guess I've done it. I've communicated the information. But if I have them walking down the street, they stop for a moment. She stops to chat with the passerby, and the little boy, she looks around and he's suddenly gone, and she's frantic, and she starts rushing from store to store to see if anybody's seen her son, and yelling, and pulls out her phone to dial 911, and she's bursting into tears as she tries to explain. And then she looks up and she sees him standing at a toy store window, staring in at the toys, and then she rushes up and hugs him. Now I have dramatized how much she loves him. I have shown it. I've made the audience feel that she loves him. If I simply say it, I've communicated the information in a way, but I haven't made the audience feel that information, and that's my job as a screenwriter, as a storyteller, again, is to make the audience feel something. That's the contract we made. So that's the distinction. The distinction is conflict. I created a conflict of the child being missing. Without that conflict, it's just people talking.
The biggest problem with dialogue is that writers often make it carry the burden of the story. Well, what you want to do is you want to tell the story visually. We're screenwriters, not speaker writers. There's a reason for that. So you want to tell the story visually and use the dialogue as icing on the cake. Once the dialogue doesn't have the burden of telling the whole story, the dialogue can play, it can be fun. I mean, it's still giving us parts of the story, but it's not carrying the whole story. So, if you watch a movie and you look at a great movie, often great movies have so much stuff that is dialogue free. I think it's Billy Wilder who did this, and the story goes to Billy Wilder, who was a great German screenwriter, came to the United States when the Nazis took over Germany, and was sleeping on Peter Lorre's couch, like many screenwriters. Quentin Tarantino was sleeping on Scotty Spiegel's couch, and Scotty Spiegel got him a screenwriting job so that he could get him the hell off his couch. So Peter Lorre wanted to get Billy Wilder the hell off his couch, and hooked him up, went to Paramount Pictures and pitched him as the greatest visual storytelling screenwriter. And so they had a scene, and I want to say it's in Dodsworth, but I could be wrong, where it was a 10-page scene where a husband and wife have a argument, and through the argument we find out that their relationship is no longer romantic or emotional in any way. They're just two people that live in the same house. And so there's 10 pages of dialogue, and they needed to cut it down. And Billy Wilder turned that into a half-page scene. And the half-page scene was husband and wife on the elevator of their building. Husband's wearing his hat. Wife's got her purse clutched to her chest. Doors open. Pretty woman gets on the elevator. Husband takes off the hat and smiles at her, and the wife basically takes a step away from the husband. That scene gives us pretty much all the information that the thrill has gone from this relationship without all that dialogue. And so always be looking for the scene that can demonstrate what's going on in the story rather than tell us through dialogue. That doesn't mean you have to get rid of dialogue, but it does mean that the dialogue can now be something else, can now have fun.
Can we show that without them saying anything or saying a lot less? Yes. Always cut the fat, cut as much as you can. The simpler it is, the cooler it can be in a weird way.
Don't make it just like how people talk in real life, because we just blabber on and on and on. We don't have that amount of time in a screenplay.
One good trick is to try and keep your sentences as short as possible, which forces you to write in a punchier fashion. That's something that I guess I learned from my journalist father. Although honestly, I tend to break that rule a lot, so I'm probably a bit hypocritical there.
The problem I see is when it's too long, then we're kind of wondering, okay, where's the conflict? What's happening here? I mean, it might be interesting, but You know, even something that's really interesting for too long will disengage an audience after a while. So you could do it, just don't do it for too long.
Oftentimes my first draft and my second draft, but maybe first to third draft, there's at least a 10-page difference of how much I've cut out.
Writers are constantly have a great line at the end of a scene, but then they add a couple more lines. They're insecurity lines, they call them. So we instantly just cross them out because they already had a great line. That's the end of the scene. And yes, everything hasn't been quite wrapped up, but that adds energy. When you cut that, you're pouring energy into the story. When you leave it there, you're sucking energy out of the story because the audience is like bored through those last two lines and going, why did we need that? I'm out of it at, you had me at a low kind of,
You don't need that beginning sentence. You're saying the same thing in repetition 2 lines from now, and really getting concise down to the point of having, or overriding where characters say something and you say it would be better if they just had a reaction. I always try to err on the side of let the actors act and emote rather than say something. If you see someone's eyes 60 feet on the screen, that's going to say a lot more than a line of dialogue, So cut. They say cut the dialogue and cut 20% more than that. And you're like, oh, lean. And no one wants to but I've read screenplays that read like a stage play. And you're like, that's not what this is. Or scenes, every director I've worked with said, give me something to shoot where the scene is just flat and 2 people sitting. That Quentin Tarantino can do it with interesting dialogue with 10 pages of dialogue, the 2 characters sitting in a dinner scene. The directors I worked with, they hate it. They're like, what are we doing? It's just this, and plus the food, it will be spoiled. It's like, takes a long time to film it,
You lose readers very quickly with overwritten dialogue. Dialogue should go at a pretty fast pace. There are going to be exceptions. You might have people make a speech every now and then, but most of the time, it's a couple of lines max, back and forth. You want to everything you can. Even if you have a character that the idea is they ramble on and on, I don't want to write that for too long because it gets tired. It's more, you would indicate that more by the character starts talking and somebody goes, oh, here he goes again, right? We don't actually want to hear the character go on and on and on. So keep that in mind. It's a really succinct version of that. A real sign of bad dialogue is where I almost feel like the writer was trying to pad their pages or something because the characters are having the same argument, maybe slightly different words, but they're making the same points over and over again. You don't do that. Make your point once and move on.
There's an old rule that you enter a scene as late as possible and you leave it as early as possible. And you make sure that you hit the main point of that scene. And if you keep that in mind, that will also tend to focus your dialogue.
Cut to the chase, what's going on? Less is always more, you know what I mean? And I've always found that, and you find, the producer I worked with, he caught the repetition in dialogue and I didn't even see it. He said, you're saying the same thing here again, we don't need it. I'm like, oh my God, you're right. And he's a big anti-repetition, producer. And I never had that before. A producer would point out those specifics. I go, you're right. I've got this bad habit now of not even seeing it. And so now I'm very cognizant of that when I work with him and in general that, we only have so much time on the screen and so many pages. And if you don't like the constraints, then write a novel. You can do whatever you want. But if you like the screenplay format, you have to have these dense, packed scenes with subtext, but not go on for 6-8 pages. There's a rhythm to it. You have a feel, like you say, when you start reading that the script's overwritten, you just know everything's described. And the writer's so afraid to let go that their vision or their ideas won't come through on the page. Well, once they take that script and make it, but you want to, your imprint is the script. So, all these other little particulars are not going to help when it's overwritten.
So on the nose dialogue usually means your characters are saying everything that they're thinking. There is no nuance, there is no subtext.
On the nose dialogue is dialogue that is generic. It is describing something that we could easily see, that is clear in the scene. It's explaining something. It's just kind of like lazy dialogue that doesn't show that character's voice.
On the nose dialogue is dialogue that's too direct and straightforward. It doesn't give the audience anything interesting to think about. Often we can find on the nose dialogue where the character is saying exactly what he means, with no spacing between the text, what he's saying, and the subtext, what he means. If I'm in love with you, and I say, I'm in love with you, that dialogue is directly on the nose. I'm telling you exactly what I mean. And for the audience watching, unless it's a very special moment, that's probably not a very interesting moment, because nothing is being challenged. Everything's a little bit too easy. If I say to you, would you like to have a cup of coffee with me? And everybody understands I'm really saying I love you. Then I've taken dialogue that's on the nose and moved it off the nose. I've given an inference or a suggestion of what I mean without stating what I mean directly. As a point of interest, I can tell you 2 different ways to say this phrase in other languages.
Oh, please.
Yes, in Spanish, it's demasiado obvio, too obvious. They don't have a metaphor for it. But in Russian, it is the beautiful slishkom vlob. Slishkom vlob, that means too much forehead, which is their way of saying on the nose. And often the difference between okay writing and great writing can be found in the distance between what is being said and what is being felt. So dialogue that's on the nose is generally not satisfying because it doesn't give the audience anything to work with or think about.
I like to say sometimes that talking heads dialogue, where it's just 2 characters talking to each other, kind of at each other, and then Q&A sessions are the worst, and that's where one character keeps asking another questions, and then they just keep answering it. So it's almost like an interview. And if that goes on for too long, it really tires out the reader, and it just gets really what we call on the nose.
The question of on the nose dialogue is not related to subtext. On the nose dialogue is defined as characters say exactly what they are thinking. And it's straightforward and it's boring. So in that example, okay, man says to the woman, I love you, I love you, I love you. And okay, so that's a bit on the nose, let's say. But the way to attack that, again, is in the rewrite stage, not when you're trying to come up with it, is there are literary devices that are ancient that you can employ. And the easiest one is irony. You take a character who says, you look like hell. Okay, that's a straightforward attack. It says, you look beautiful. Just flip it completely upside down. And they'll be like, what do you mean? I couldn't sleep last night. They'll defend themselves because they're going to get it. Because a lot of human interaction is ironic. And we talked about in the other book, the Science of Screenwriting, that there are theories that human beings, in order to function as a society, need to have plausible deniability. You need to test things out around an explosive issue like sex. I mean, what if you're interested in somebody, but you're not sure you should ask them out, because maybe there's a problem. So you could go up to them and tell them a story about, there was this guy I know, and he was really in love with this girl, but she was already involved with somebody. And, and the target of the seduction may know exactly they're talking about her, but if the person says, I'm married, it says, well, I didn't say it, I was just telling a story. See, but so you have irony. Irony is basically saying 2 opposite things at the same time. And it's pouring rain. I love this weather, and people get it. Or nice shoes you got there. And people go, what's wrong with them? You know, they're gonna understand it. It's in the tone and the way you do it. But it's like, I didn't say anything. I just said they're nice shoes. That's all. So irony is a useful one.
If you set a scene in your movie, it's got to be as realistic as your own life. So in your memories, if you're writing a divorce scene, or say a scene where someone breaks up with someone, often what I find people write on the nose dialogue, so they're like, I am breaking up with you now. And I'm like, when I broke up with people, did I ever say those words? I don't think I ever used those words. And I've broken up with some people, unfortunately. And if you go into your own memory log and you look at how did that happen with me? Is there anything I can draw from this? Was there a moment, or was it just like silence? It's not working anymore. What isn't working? I don't know, this whole thing. It's just, and you look at the sea, maybe you parked your car on the seafront and you're like, yeah, it's been many years, but I think it's definitely time that we just, you know, and then, okay. You know, so you don't actually say, in life, very often we don't say like these very clear moments. However, the difference between live dialogue and screen dialogue is that we do have to clearly communicate to the audience that they're breaking up. So, you know, it's kind of where you go to your external sources well and say, well, how did they do it in that movie? And do I need to actually say, at some point, I do have to say, we are broken up officially, so the audience understands that they're broken up. And this is the difficulty between what I call street dialogue and screen dialogue. And well, stage dialogue is also different, because stage dialogue is all about the words, and, you know, often, not all stage plays, but often stage plays is about language, it's about, you know, the uses of language. And street dialogue is totally different, but screen dialogue, as a writer, you're writing because you have to communicate some information to an audience through your characters. And that's the delicate balance, is using your memory well to write realistic sounding dialogue, but then also using the external sources well, and knowing that it's got to serve a purpose, it's got to move the story forward. So sometimes it has to be slightly on the nose.
Time spent trying to deliver exposition through dialogue is mostly time wasted. Obviously, some of it is necessary. Sometimes it's the only way to communicate things is through dialogue, technical things, information that they need to know, but it's not the most effective way.
You might get a note that says, I need somebody to just make it plain. I need someone to just say it, because we're all kind of lost in the sauce of what's going on here.
Sometimes characters are on the nose more, and sometimes they talk all in subtext. More often it's a bit of a mix, you know, or you're going to have different moments of that.
Every now and then you may have a complicated sequence that you want to help the reader check in and kind of orient themselves. So you might have a character say something, you know, why did you bring, you know, I told you to bring the red car, why did you bring the blue car, you know? That reminds the reader that, oh, they switched cars back there, remember that, you know? So you might want to plant something that is a bit on the nose. You know, I don't feel like a writer should feel the pressure to write, you know, Sorkin-esque dialogue for every single character. Every single character doesn't have to have incredibly stylized dialogue.
Every single line of dialogue is not going to have subtext, or no one's going to know what we're talking about, right? Like at some point, you got to say it out loud, especially if you're writing something that's like science fiction, or, you know, something that's already pretty difficult for us to understand, like something political, etc. At some point, someone's just got to keep it simple and make it very plain about what's going on, or we're all going to be lost. So sometimes on the nose dialogue is okay, and you won't get that note about it. You might get a note that says, I need somebody to just make it plain. I need someone to just say it, because we're all kind of lost in the sauce of what's going on here. There can be dialogue that's too poetic, right? Like it's so poetic that we aren't really having a conversation anymore, and we aren't really pushing the story forward anymore. We're just saying nice flowery things, right? So I think no matter what, unless again you've just got a natural knack at it, and some people do, that it takes a little while to figure out dialogue, especially because you're writing for so many characters, and not all of those characters are going to sound the same, talk the same, you know, use the same cadence in their speaking, etc. And so I think it's a skill set that it takes a little while to kind of figure out.
I think with dialogue, there's a value in the subtext of the want, like you're describing. I also think that the want is something that you can hit on the nose with the character just declaring, I want blank. And I think that I have seen that done incredibly well, where it's great for the audience because you
Hey.
know what
Okay.
the character wants. So there's a value in the subtext as long as we don't miss the want. And there's a value in the dialogue sometimes defining the want on the nose for the audience.
There's a little bit of poetry to writing dialogue, right? There are puns, and like a lot of the greatest dialogue that we think about are things that I probably would not have said that in real life. You know what I mean? So there is a little bit of that happens. And not everybody's good at that, and that's fine. I'm not necessarily all that great at it unless I'm writing like old Southern women or men. Then I can give them all the poetry there is, but that's because I grew up around those people, so I know the kind of poetry that. But generally speaking, it usually just means that, on the nose literally means like you can't miss it. It's right there. And you want some of that dialogue to be far more nuanced so that you can play with everything else in the scene. The words don't have to tell us everything. So it's a little bit of show don't tell, right? The words don't have to tell us everything. How can we find out other things? Or how can you say this to me without saying it to me, right? So there's like this, I'm gonna call it a meme. I don't think that's what it is. But they say, tell me you're an 80s baby without telling me you're an 80s baby. Oh, well, one of my first concerts was The Temptations, which probably would make me like a 70s baby, but I went with my parents, right? So, but that would be my way of saying that instead of just walking in and saying, I'm an 80s baby. I'd go, well, my first concert was Prince. And then people would probably go, oh, okay, you were probably born in the whatever time. So the same thing is true with your dialogue. Let's go back to our young lady who's cursing out her mother. How can she show her mother that she's upset with her without saying, I'm upset with you? That's how you're going to write dialogue that's not on the nose. That's how you're going to get the subtext. That's how you're going to get the nuance. So, for example, one of the examples I love, and hopefully I can remember the name of this film, it's about cowboys and it's on Netflix. But the son asks the father, why don't you love me? And instead of the father saying, I love you, and here are all the reasons why, he tells a story about naming him. And it's because I gave you your name that we understand he loves him. He never says, I love you. He never says, no, son, you gotta believe it, I love you. Instead, he tells this beautiful story about how he chose his name. That's subtext. That's nuance. That's not being on the nose. The on the nose response would be, I love you.
I think the best dialogue comes from the best listeners.
Good dialogue writers also have really good ears, and they're listening to the way people speak, and they remember those sorts of things.
Hearing things, writing things down, writing down expressions like, oh my God, what a great expression. What does that mean? I'm going to take that, it's just the dynamic between people, kinds of relationships. Who's talking to who at the supermarket, listening to a couple arguing or being too nice to each other or whatever it is, it's fascinating. I'm always writing things down. Listening to how people talk, listening to interesting people around, how they talk, and then once you write your dialogue, read it out loud, do a table read with friends or your writers group, or just even if you read it out loud yourself.
All my characters, no matter how small the part is I'm just trying to get in the headspace of that character's point of view. And so I'm constantly trying to, and I basically, when I write, I act out the parts in my head as I'm writing them. And I used to think I was crazy. And then I read an interview with Aaron Sorkin where he said he played all the parts as he wrote them in his head. And I thought, oh, I do too. I was with this relief that, okay, well, the great screenwriter of our times is what he does. So, and that had been my process. So that's what I'm constantly just trying to get into the voice and the headspace of the characters as I write them.
Well, what I do is
Okay,
I try to
that's like really reinforced as well.
A voice for each character, right? Now, sometimes it'll be the voice of an actor that I know, right? I mean, not personally.
Okay.
I've seen movies with that actor. So, like when we made Hugh Grant at one point when he was making British, I had Hugh Grant's voice in my head, so it was a lot easier to write that dialogue, hearing it coming from his voice in here, and then the acting out part of it is
I must have looked like a crazy person because there, one of the apartments that we lived in back then was on the third floor of the Toluca Lake area of this apartment building, and there was a little tiny office at the top of it. A little tiny office. There was an access door to the roof, right? And back then, I could but I'd come up with a scene, or I'd be close to doing the scene, and it'd be 2 o'clock in the morning, and I'd go outside onto the roof, and I'd be walking around like acting out the part, and trying to come up with the dialogue that would be true to the character and not be too expositional, which is something that all of us screenwriters must avoid, and see if it works. See if it works just at least, out loud or in my head. And that's what I would finally commit to. You put it away for a week and you come back to it, and it really is glaring. Like, did I write that? This the bumps for me. This character doesn't sound like, and many times people find it's good to speak the dialogue aloud or have table reads where they can hear it. Like you do in plays, that doesn't quite sound like that character. And the actor is a good person for that, to really, read and go, this kind of doesn't, you know what I mean? Like in a reading, the actor would take the character in and go, this doesn't really sound right. Okay, it's your workshopping type of thing.
Have actors read it out loud. They don't have to be professional actors, but just you and a friend read it out loud, listen to how it flows.
Listening to readings, I find readings incredibly valuable workshopping. And films and TV should be the same way. Actors are not shy about telling you what doesn't work for them. Just like singers are not shy about telling a songwriter, hey, when I land on that, it doesn't go, the words don't go with the notes. Sort of a simple answer to your question, though, is read your dialogue aloud. Yes, very good point. I don't do it, but you can start saying, well, that's not coming off my tongue very easily. I don't think I want to ask somebody to say that. When composers compose and you're writing for an orchestra and you don't know how to play the French horn and you can't play the oboe, and quite often after it's done, you have people play through the parts.